how do bank reserves interact with the Eurodollar system? And I think a related question is, are all Eurodollars de facto, do they all de facto arise from bank credit creation, or do they arise from a variety of different other channels?
As Milton Friedman said in 1969, it's the stroke of a bookkeeper's pen. So yes, banks create the dollars, and it doesn't have to be an American bank. It can be any bank, so long as it's part of the club, so long as it's part of the Eurodollar cartel. As long as it goes along with the internal restrictions and constraints that the banking club has set for each other, they're able to manage their balance sheets as they see fit. So if the bank wants to grow, that's perfectly fine. And if it wants to create dollars while doing so, that's what happens. So the role of bank reserves is nominal at best, and bank reserves don't go outside the United States, which is why the Fed, when we get to 2007 and 2008, and again in 2020, also 2011, had to create these overseas dollar swaps to try to sort of jam reserves into overseas places, because as the Eurodollar system broke down, it left these banks outside the United States short of US dollar funding, which they couldn't get from the Fed because the Fed only operates to the US boundary and not outside, and which left, of course, the Fed to scramble to try to come up with different ways to jam bank reserves into foreign places, which it didn't go that well because, again, there really isn't a very big place for bank reserves as far as liquidity in the Eurodollar system. And there's a number of reasons for that.
How is my audio? How is my audio?
It's hot. It's you're loud, but
how about now?
Oh, much clearer.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to jump in and make clear to the audience, because Jeff, you said that the banks create dollars. I just want to re-underline the point. They're not actually committing a felony and counterfeiting real dollars. Really, they're creating promises on their ledger balance that they can get you dollars, physical dollars, I guess, if you want them, but nobody does at that huge, gigantic level, right? At that wholesale value. Who wants to take delivery of palletfuls of dollars? So these are promises that the banks say that you believe because they have independent third-party auditors, lawyers, and so forth, and everyone, and they're part of the club, that they can do it if you want to, but you don't. And that's how they get away with creating dollars out of thin air from a bookkeeper's pen. That's not illegal. They're creating promises.
Which is why, Jeff, you described it as the Eurodollar system as a global ledger system, as opposed to, for the most part, a global monetary system, because for the most part, there's no actual money exchange. It's just debits and credits transferring between different bank balance sheets effectively.
It's not high-powered money, right? In essence, it's not the actual ballast of the system, the actual dollars. It's just basically liabilities that are being added to their balance sheet as they lend out those dollars, right? So those dollars are only come into existence in the form of loans.
Largely, yeah, and it could be interbank loans too. So, but I think that's a great point that you just made, Richard, which is, high-powered money, that term that Milton Friedman coined a long time ago. What the Eurodollar system did was essentially take the next step in evolution, which was to eliminate the high-powered money entirely and just go off the ledger. When you step back and look at the Eurodollar system, it's really nothing more than fractional reserve lending, which is where banks create credit off of claims on high-powered money. As Emil just said, well, nobody really wants high-powered money anymore, so now we just have claims on high-powered money that nobody wants, so the money itself are those claims. It's almost like the chartalists in the 1920s had won the argument where they said any token will do, as long as we all accept the tokens, and as long as we all accept the verdict from these banks keeping track on the ledger, then these claims on high-powered money without any high-powered money actually becomes the money itself. And that's, I think, part of the misunderstanding that most of the public has. Emil and I, we just talked about this recently. In the 1930s, when FDR and his administration confiscated gold using 6102, everybody thinks that was the government establishing a firm monopoly on money, because what we're led to believe is that we lost the ability to use commodity money, which is separate outside the banking system, so that the only money we would have left to use would be Federal Reserve notes, physical cash. But even by the 1930s, hand-to-hand cash and hand-to-hand currency had already gone out of favor. I mean, most people, especially for large commercial transactions, were already using checks. So the U.S. economy and the world economy in general had already moved to a ledger money system, a fractional reserve system, where there isn't a lot of high-powered money being transferred back and forth, long before we even got to the 1930s. And with 6102, the restriction of commodity money inside the United States, it essentially freed the banking system to pursue this lack of high-powered money, ledger money, liability system, which is exactly what they did. And then you marry that with the 1950s Triffin's paradox, this globalization wave, telecommunication, and just the Eurodollar banks took it another step forward, where it's a complete virtual system, no high-powered money, as Emil said. There are no pallets of cash. And banks really in the Eurodollar system aren't really doing what they had, anything different than they had done before. They just brought it into this international format and then experimented with all these different transactions, these different ways to, as you're pointing to, Adam, they're not exchanging cash flow, or they're not exchanging cash. They're exchanging future cash flows, for example. That's really what swaps are. So it becomes this really ephemeral, esoteric system where when you get past high-powered money, no longer need reserves. This reserveless system is basically a blank canvas for banks to experiment, which gets back to the original point that we're making here, is that when banks are allowed to experiment in all these various transactions, and they don't include central banks in that experimentation, central banks are kind of left by the wayside. And that's what really happened in 2007, is you had this complete separate evolution that had been ongoing for decades, perfected in some ways, and then it got out of control throughout the 90s and 2000s, as we know, housing bubble, corporate credit around the world. And then when it started to fall apart, when it started to implode, there was just no way to stop it at that point.